Joseph, your book is particularly nice to read because not only do you tell us about Chesterton himself, but you clearly love Chesterton. And this is actually something that's quite typical. He's often described as a genial writer. Why is it that people like Chesterton so much?
Well, I sometimes say to people, when people ask me, I've not read Chesterton, where should I start? And I say, and I don't believe I'm being mercenary, that a good place to start is my biography. And that's because not only does it obviously give Chesterton's life chronologically, as a biography should, and therefore the context of the times in which he lives, but I actually do quote from the major works, paragraph here, paragraph there. So you're actually getting snippets. And otherwise, Chesterton wrote on so many different topics that when someone asks me, where should I start? You really need to know more about the person asking. Do you like poetry or prose? Do you like history, or do you like fiction or non-fiction? Are you interested in politics? So you need to have answers to those questions before you can answer it. So that's why I just default and direct people to my biography. And I do say as well that was an act of thanksgiving. That biography is my first book as a Catholic. Act of thanksgiving to God for giving me Chesterton, because Chesterton under grace was the most important influence upon my own conversion. And also giving thanksgiving to Chesterton, and therefore for giving me God. So that book was an act of love and an act of thanksgiving.
Chesterton says that the book Orthodoxy isn't meant to be an ecclesiastical treatise, but itself is a kind of lovely autobiography, I think he calls it. Actually, it's apt probably to start discussing the book by discussing Chesterton's life and understanding a bit about how the themes and ideas came to develop before he published the book in 1908. He wrote his own biography, or his own autobiography, and in it he said that his childhood was a happy childhood. Is that the case?
Well, his childhood certainly was a happy childhood. His parents, were happily married, and he had an idyllic childhood with his brother. Not unproblematic, but certainly was a happy childhood. But Orthodoxy is haunted, and you can tell this. I mean, it's an interesting discussion itself. That 1908, when Orthodoxy was written, was also the year in which Chesterton wrote *The Man Who Was Thursday*. And it's very interesting to see the two books side by side, because quite clearly, *The Man Who Was Thursday* is overshadowed by Chesterton's experience at art school. And that really Orthodoxy is his autobiographical emerging from the darkness and pessimism and decadence of the art school, the Victor Slade School of Art on the University of London at the beginning of the 1890s. The fin de siècle. So I know art school in the age of wild. You can probably imagine the rest. So Orthodoxy, in many respects, yes, his childhood was happy, but Orthodoxy, I think, is an autobiographical treatment of his emergence from the doldrums into which he had moved because of the impact, not just of the decadence, but of, for instance, radical pessimist philosophers such as Schopenhauer.
Okay, let's focus a bit on how he gets into decadence. So before he moves to the state school, he's at St. Paul's School, which is a top independent boarding school in London. He isn't a very good pupil there. He finds a place at the bottom of the class and says he's happy there. He doesn't care all that much about academic success, but he is intellectually switched on. He's part of a debating club that gives him lots of pleasure, and they form a magazine called, is it The Debater? And then as he goes to Slade, his friends, they all go off to Oxford and Cambridge, and he's at art school in London on his own, fairly miserable. Could we focus a little bit on how he gets into decadence and the kind of aesthetic rejection of morality, or ordinary morality, that you see in Wilde and some figures like Baudelaire?
Sure. He says in his autobiography, I mean, you're correct, Orthodoxy is certainly a quasi-autobiography. It's an intellectual progress, a pilgrim progress, if you like, from this radical pessimism and decadence to Christian conversion. But we in the autobiography he wrote, which was his autobiography, and just before he died in 1936, he makes it clear that he has never been tempted to the particular vice of wild. So it looks as if he didn't actually become part, for instance, of any homosexual practices or things like that. But he says, the other types of perversion of sin, he was certainly, although the impression you get is it's mostly in the mind. I don't think that Chesterton was sort of out in the red light districts or anything like that, but I think that most of it was interior, but he was full of dark and morbid ideas, and certainly influenced by say, the ideas such as Schopenhauer, where he said, atheism was for him a leap of faith. To be able to believe that anything existed beyond the mind, to him was a leap of faith. So, the atheism in some sense was too credulous. The only thing you'd be really sure about is the fact that my mind exists, and everything else could just be some phantasm that's being projected by my mind. So that was, if you like, the ground zero, the doldrums that he was in, and then he emerges from that with basically a what you might call a fundamentalist or fundamentalist optimism, that even if the mind is the only thing that exists, and even if trees and sunsets and sunrises are a product of the imagination, they are good things. I'm going to be grateful for the fact that this beauty exists, irrespective of where its source is. And he says, basically, I was saved with one thin thread of thanks. It was thanksgiving, it was gratitude that saved him from this radical pessimism.
That's an excellent description of how he comes to that sort of basic point. But he's still, at this stage, not a Christian, even. And he doesn't come from a particularly religious background. The milieu that he finds himself in, as we've described, isn't Christian, is in fact very hostile to Christianity. And then he finds himself leaving Slade, deciding not to be an artist, which is another difficult part of his life. And he ends up working in a publisher's. Would you tell us a bit about that time in his life?
Yeah, so you're right. So his parents were sort of vaguely Christian. I mean, their theology, such as it was probably closer to Unitarianism. So he certainly wasn't raised in an Orthodox Christian home. But, there's something about a Christian culture that might actually have some such element of pervasiveness, even in an agnostic environment. So, for instance, even some of his young poetry, he's clearly enamored of the person of St. Francis of Assisi. He's sort of haunted by St. Francis throughout his life. And so you have, if you like, he's being accompanied by these Christian iconic figures, even if he doesn't himself have the Christian faith. So yes, obviously, there's a wonderful essay I would recommend by Chesterton called "The Diabolist," which is gives an account of an encounter he had with a Dorian Gray type person at the Slade School of Art, and it's recording in horror against that sort of decadence that leads him, I think, out of the Slade School of Art. He just didn't want to be in that milieu any longer for his own health and sanity. He needed to get out of there. And then just because his strength, I mean, he actually is a very good artist. But his other strength was literature. As you say, the Junior Debating Club at St. Paul's, they read widely, they debated widely, they wrote widely. And so he finding himself sort of falling into the publishing world was really providential, because this is clearly where his strengths lie as a reader of great literature, and of course, as we discover fairly quickly by 1900 when he's first published, as a writer about literature, who immediately becomes a household name because his writing style is so unique and entertaining, and people want to read him.
And he's prolific as a journalist. He writes for as many publications as he can, to the point that people are worried that he'll burn out of nervous exhaustion or won't have a chance to fully realize his obviously enormous talent. And around this time, I don't know if it's 1900 or 1901, he meets his wife-to-be, Frances Bloggs. And there are a few figures in Chesterton's life who are enormously important in the development of his thinking and especially of his Christianity. And we won't have time to discuss them all in the detail actually they deserve to be discussed in. But Frances Bloggs, his wife, is one of them, and is incredibly important because she is actually a practicing Christian.
She is, and she actually what she does is to she brings the element of, should we say, psychological stability to Chesterton. That's not to say that Chesterton's unstable. He's not unstable, but he's sort of a bit all over the place. There's something, if you look at Chesterton's art, he's a caricaturist, and that says psychologically a great deal about him. Everything he does is done with spontaneity and at speed. So whether it's art, he's never going to meticulously paint a landscape or a portrait that takes this intense concentration over a period of time. He's going to do something quickly, and it's going to be brilliant but fast. So that's why he insisted he was a jolly journalist. He could turn out essays very quickly, but when we look at some of his other work, you can see that particularly his poetry, much of it suffers because he doesn't take the necessary time. So this is all preamble because that sort of personality needs someone like Frances Blogg to give him a settled space, a home, not just in a physical sense, but in a psychological sense. And he becomes very dependent upon her. That for all the everyday domestic aspects of things, he becomes very dependent on her. And you're right. One of the things that's very much an aspect of Frances is her deep Christian faith. She's a very settled Anglican, and she has a lived Christian faith, and that is important to Chesterton. I think Chesterton starts to embrace Christianity as an idea, perhaps before he actually believes, as a desirable thing, even if he didn't have the faith. And that's largely due to Frances, and also around the same time as he meets Frances, he meets Hilaire Belloc. And Hilaire Belloc's another significant influence on Chesterton's move towards Christian orthodoxy.
And he's someone who is quite difficult to get a handle on. He's got so many ideas, and he's so extraordinarily energetic. But Hilaire Belloc is a Catholic with a French background, and he's someone who Chesterton almost immediately hits it off with, and then quite quickly becomes associated with. He's called Chester Belloc, I think, by George Bernard Shaw. And the four-legged beast. Would you tell us a bit about Hilaire Belloc and how he influenced Chesterton, how important that influence was?
Yeah, so I think that what you see in the relationship between Chesterton and Belloc, and you're right, George Bernard Shaw gave them the title, the Chester Belloc, as two halves of a pantomime elephant, he calls them. So they're so much together that they're two halves of the same beast. So they were seen synonymously. And I think that the dynamic is, at the beginning, in other words, the early 1900s, Chesterton's really largely almost a disciple of Belloc. But as Chesterton grows in faith and wisdom, Belloc actually becomes more dependent upon Chesterton. And I think by the end, that Belloc is much more in need of Chesterton than Chesterton is of Belloc, or that they remain great friends. But at the beginning, and this is very important, not only, of course, does Belloc is 4 years older, but the actual age difference is much greater, because by the time that they first meet in 1900, Belloc has served in the French army. He's traipsed across the United States in pursuit of his love, Elodie, who he will eventually marry. He's married by this stage. He has children by this stage, and he's published at this stage. He's already published a biography of Danton, the French revolutionary leader, and volume of poetry. So it's much more than the 4 years. Belloc's the man of the world. And the other thing is that Chesterton embraces Belloc's view of Europe. So this Europe of the faith, this sort of broadening Chesterton's understanding of Christendom. That I think he gets that from Belloc at the beginning, but also, and this was more of a negative consequence, that Belloc was very romantically attached to the French Revolution. And the way I try to explain this to my friends in America, that to be a patriot in America, you have to subscribe to the Republic, right? The American Republic. If you don't subscribe to the American Republic, you're not a patriot. You're not really American. And as many French people, certainly in 1900, the early 1900s, that to be a patriotic Frenchman, you have to support the Republic, right? The French Revolution. So Belloc has this sort of romantic attachment to the Revolution, which Chesterton imbibes and subscribes to, and that I think is one of the weak points in both of their writings, is this somewhat naive. Actually, in Orthodoxy, he talks about the Jacobins having more pedigree than the Jacobites. So there's that negative side, but Belloc has a first-class honors degree from Oxford in history. So also he deepens Chesterton's understanding of history, particularly European history. And finally, also very importantly, Belloc was already basically politically and economically a distributist. And he's embraced the economic and political philosophy rooted in Catholic social teaching. Specifically the paper encyclical Verum Novarum, published in 1891 by Pope Leo XIII. And also Belloc actually knew the aging Cardinal Manning. And Cardinal Manning was a great social figure, a great friend of the poor, and had a great thinker on social issues. So Belloc basically gave to the young Chesterton, a knowledge of history, a knowledge of Europe, a knowledge of politics, and a knowledge of economics. So Belloc broadens Chesterton. So if you like, Francis Blogg stabilizes him, gives him a home and a base, and Belloc broadens him so he can actually see more widely. So those two people, again, right at the turn of the century, 1900, when Chesterton's first published, they're the two people that are really transforming Chesterton into this bigger thing that we come to see in Orthodoxy.
We might say a little bit here about the charge of anti-Semitism that's often leveled at Chesterton, and that he's generally taken to have adopted from Belloc.
Well, I think that would probably be slightly unfair on Belloc, although it also perhaps might be partly true. Belloc certainly was more antagonistic towards the Jews naturally than Chesterton was. But, it's very important here that we understand the context. That it's very difficult for us to understand the way people discussed the Jewish question prior to the rise of the Nazis, and prior to the Third Reich, and prior to the Holocaust, right? Once Chesterton and Belloc saw where anti-Semitism could lead, when they saw the rise of Hitler, both of them were horrified by Hitler. That they basically retracted some of the things they said earlier about the Jews. Basically, Winston Churchill said things against the Jews. All sorts of people were talking about there being a Jewish question. And of course, Belloc wrote a book called The Jews. And what I would say, by the way, is that if from the perspective of, say, an authentic, real, hardline anti-Semite, the Jews is a very wishy-washy, soft, Belloc's book on the Jews, wishy-washy, soft, neither here nor there, middle-of-the-road type approach. So even when Belloc is at his most anti-Semitic, he's not an anti-Semite in the way that the Nazis were. So it's important for us to make that distinction. But nonetheless, there were one or two things that Chesterton and Belloc said, which certainly taken out of context, will make us wince and should make us wince, because they were not only ill-advised, they were lacking charity.
Perfect. And to just talk about a third figure who Chesterton met not long before he published Orthodoxy, the figure who was actually to receive him into the Catholic faith, Father John O'Connor, who's a Catholic priest. Chesterton met while he was on holiday with his wife, and he was to have an enormous influence on Chesterton thereafter.
Yes, I mean, that this was the first priest that Chesterton had really known, an Irishman that was based in Yorkshire. And what Chesterton got from Father O'Connor was this understanding of the connection between wisdom and innocence. So my biography of Chesterton is called Wisdom and Innocence, A Life of G.K. Chesterton, because that's a paradox. And many of us think, well, you have to choose between wisdom or innocence, right? You can't have both. But of course, wisdom is innocence is not the same thing as naivete, right? Now, the opposite of innocence is not wisdom; it's guilt. And in other words, that we have to have a natural innocence, I mean, even if we know what evil is, even if we've been very evil, right? We have to know that innocence is better than guilt, that purity is better than impurity, that living without sinning is better than sinning. And so that's that sort of innocence. And then there's a wisdom. And Chesterton sort of says, the Catholic priests, what they hear in confession, there's a whole catalogue of other people's sins that are being brought out to them. So this connection with wisdom and innocence, Father O'Connor becomes the model in some sense for Chesterton's fictional detective, Father Brown, who becomes probably certainly in terms of remunerative income, Father Brown's probably the most popular thing Chesterton writes, and it's based upon Father O'Connor. And again, the first volume of Father Brown's stories is called The Innocence of Father Brown. And then a later volume is called The Wisdom of Father Brown. And it's not because Father Brown has ceased to be innocent that he has wisdom. On the contrary, the two go hand in hand in someone who's seeking holiness. And ultimately, it's the idea that sanity and sanctity are synonymous, right? And so, the sanctity is the innocence, or at least the quest for innocence, the belief in innocence, and then sanity, of course, is wisdom. So sanity and sanctity, wisdom and innocence, we see it in Father Brown. Chesterton's bringing together, and that was modelled on Father John O'Connor.
About this time, Chesterton begins to debate Christianity in print, and he begins to have debates about Christianity and about the Catholic Church. Would you like to tell us a bit about his first forays into the topic?
Yeah, so what begins to happen, he writes a book, I think in 1904, called Heretics, where he basically criticizes many of his contemporaries, famous people such as George Bernard Shaw, Rudyard Kipling, and others, for their heresy. In other words, the things about their philosophy, their view of the world, their view of life, which is in Chesterton's view incorrect. And so what we have is sort of a via negativa, if you like, that he's coming to Christianity through realizing that all of the anti-Christian perspectives are wrong, and that there's something unbalanced about all of these various approaches to reality that have rejected Christianity. And so, and this is what is played out in Orthodoxy, basically, that, he comes to see, well, all these attacks on Christianity are self-contradictory, and, at the end, all of these ideas are so full of holes that the only thing left standing is the traditional Christian church, and therefore, by default, it's true because all the attacks upon it evidently are untrue. So there's this via negativa approach to Chesterton's approach to Christianity, and of course, we mustn't forget the presence of the Christian faith of his wife Frances in the background, just doing it, being it, practicing it. And Chesterton says in his biography of William Cobbett, he says that William Cobbett's wife was the powerful silence in his life, and Frances is that powerful silence in the background. So while Chesterton is fencing with all these his contemporaries with their ideas and what's wrong with their ideas, in the background there's this powerful Christian silence, which again, paradoxically, is the silence that speaks.
And as a consequence of Heretics, he received some attacks, which ultimately go on to lead him to write Orthodoxy, which is kind of, you say Heretics is the via negativa, Orthodoxy is the positive statement of his philosophy, and he says at the beginning of the book that this is his basic statement of his philosophy.
So he said, he basically says that he's responding to someone that wrote a review of Heretics and said, I will take Chesterton's attacks on heresy seriously when he deigns to give us his own orthodoxy. So what, rather than just attacking everybody else, what do you actually believe? And as Chesterton says, well, if someone needs not the least provocation to write a book, that was all I needed. And orthodoxy, of course, I see parallels with C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, because what he's trying to do here is to make it a defense through reason of the fundamental Christian position. He's not a Catholic, and so he's trying to find what Lewis would call the highest common factors. So absolutely emphatically not the lowest common denominators, right? Where basically the Christianity just disappears into the zeitgeist. But what is it that makes Christianity different from the zeitgeist? What is it that, if you like, is the presence of the Heideggergeist, not the zeitgeist, that highest common factor? And of course, what Chesterton does, he takes the Apostles' Creed, right? He says the Apostles' Creed is the statement of what it is to be a Christian as believed by the apostles, and that's the orthodoxy that I am defending in this book.
Okay, and that takes us nicely to orthodoxy. So at the beginning of the book, he opens with a story, an allegory about a man who thought he had discovered a new island, but really ended up at Brighton. What does he mean by this?
Well, that basically that he fearlessly went out in pursuit of the unknown and discovered what was already known. In other words, that the only thing that's truly original is sin, and only the original sin, not all the copycats since then. So the original sin of pride is original. Everything else isn't. So same thing with the quest for truth. Okay, that the Plato, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle are baptized, if you like, by Augustine, Aquinas, and theologically and philosophically, it's all encapsulated in the life and teaching of Jesus Christ, and very importantly, the church he established, which has that magisterial, that teaching authority throughout the centuries. So, but what Chesterton discovers is not something new, which he was looking for, something new. So he's like the yachtsman who goes out in exploration of the South Sea island that's never been discovered, and then lands and thinks he's discovered it, and realizes that all the things he's discovered have already been discovered, and in fact, what it is the old Christian ideas that he had only now realized were true. So he'd come home, and people who are converts to Christianity, it always feels as if you've come home. So there's a series on EWTN, the Journey Home, and there's the Coming Home Network. So I think that this ultimately, when someone discovers Christianity, they are also actually coming home, even if they haven't actually been there before.
And he goes on from this point to talk about madness and the root of madness. He says the root of madness is not actually irrationality. He says that poets don't go mad, which we might quibble with, but he says that in fact the mad people are, generally speaking, great reasoners, and this is obviously a Chestertonian paradox. And could you help us to unpack exactly what he means by that?
Yeah, the example he gives as opposed to the poet doesn't go mad, and I agree that we could quibble with that. Some poets certainly have. But he uses the example of a chess player. In other words, the pure reason in the absence, well, it's not even pure reason, it's pure logic, which is not the same thing as pure reason. That's the point. That pure logic in itself is more likely to drive you mad than a broader understanding of the rational cosmos. And certainly, the one definition of madness is someone who plays chess against himself, right? If you're playing both sides in the game of chess, then you're on a slippery slope to insanity. So I think that's what Chesterton's getting at, is that the madness often is taking one aspect of reason, and say in the case of chess, logic, one aspect of reason, and then running with it to such a degree that it becomes the whole of reason. So you take one aspect and make it the whole. That's when you become insane. So what you have to do is to keep all the various facets of the rational cosmos in balance with each other and in communion with each other. And that is orthodoxy.
Yeah, no, I think you see that very clearly when you think about the ways in which a paranoid individual might reason, and the kind of reasons they would produce to justify their belief that they were being spied on by the government or whatever else it might be. He also suggests that the modern world, if not quite mad, has gone deeply awry in something like this way, the modern world as a whole, and that this has produced relativism, skepticism, and so forth. What kinds of process have led to that, according to Chesterton?
Well, basically, it's a process of reductionism. That once you start abandoning the tenets of orthodoxy, the tenets of faith, you're left flailing in the dark, and you're also left in a process of reductionism leads to reductio ad absurdum. So, radical pessimism, Schopenhauer. If you're gonna insist that we can only believe that which we can absolutely prove, right? Then but through a process of reduction, you end up with nothing exists except mind. And clearly at this point, your philosophy, which has followed a rational process the whole way, has actually also been a reductionist process the whole way. And so the modern world has fallen away from the richness of the fullness of truth, which is Christian orthodoxy, into various sort of fragmented, reductionist misunderstandings of orthodoxy. And that's why these various different schools of thought always accuse Christianity of being two mutually contradictory things, too puritanical or not puritanical enough, etc.
And actually, instead of going to the modern world, the adult world of sort of grown-up skepticism and rationality, he advocates going back to the stories of childhood, to fairy tales. And he says that these are the things that shaped his ultimate attitudes to life, and he thinks that they are essentially correct. Can you talk to us a little bit about the ethics of Elfland?
The ethics of Elfland, the chapter in Orthodoxy, which is my personal favorite, has been hugely influential, actually, before we talk about what it says. The ethics of Elfland was a major influence on J.R.R. Tolkien, on C.S. Lewis. So a lot of the great works of literature produced in the 20th century, such as the Chronicles of Narnia or the Lord of the Rings, at least in part, are due to the influence of this chapter. So that in itself is something worth noting. But the key thing here is we have to distinguish, and Chesterton does, and it's very crucial that we do, between that which is childlike and that which is childish. So in the gospel, the Christ says, unless you become like little children, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. So unless we're childlike, we can't attain the fullness of truth, right? But St. Paul says, when I was a child, I thought like a child, and now I'm no longer a child, I put away childish things. So we also meant to grow up. We're meant to grow up without growing weary, skeptical, cynical. In other words, we're meant to grow up, cease being childish while remaining childlike, to retain that innocence while attaining wisdom. So that is the crucial thing here. And what he says about fairy stories, and this is beautiful, he basically says it's not earth that judges heaven, it's heaven that judges the earth. Therefore, it's not the earth that judges fairyland, it's fairyland that judges the earth. And he's not saying that heaven is fairyland, by the way. But the point is, what fairy stories show us is not just how things are, and they do, as Tolkien says, and other people have said, the fairy stories hold up a mirror to man, the mirror of scorn and pity to man. So they hold up a mirror to show us who we are, but they also show us who we should be and who we shouldn't be. All right. So the important thing about fairy stories is they show us the flawed, broken reality, but they also show us the fullness of reality, healing, right? And also the consequences of refusing healing, which is wickedness. So there's this, it's a physical mirror, but it's also a metaphysical mirror, a mirror that shows us a moral perspective. And that's why fairy stories are valuable, not because they are an escape from reality. They are an escape from a reductionist reality into a fuller understanding of reality.
And he goes on after sort of discussing fairy stories and the ways in which we can learn from them. He goes on to another of his favorite topics, which has come up in his writing before and is most fully worked out here: optimism and pessimism. And
yeah, optimism and pessimism for Chesterton are two extremes, both of which are wrong. Again, to remind ourselves, he wrote The Man Who Was Thursday, a novel I thoroughly recommend, by the way. It's the greatest of Chesterton's novels. In the same year, he wrote Orthodoxy. So reading the two side by side is a very interesting exercise, because you see, what ideas are really important to him. And, two of the philosophers in The Man Who Was Thursday, one's an optimist and the other's a pessimist. And the novel sort of shows that both views are wrong. So to believe, for instance, a radical optimistic position would be the ideas of someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? That there's no such thing as original sin, that we're all basically a good, healthy tabula rasa, and it's only civilization which corrupts us. That if somehow we could get back to the garden, then everybody would be happy in this world. We can have paradise on earth. That is a naive optimism. And then the pessimism is that radical skepticism that leads to cynicism. So again, these two extremes are nowhere near the via media of reality, which is found in orthodoxy.
And the reality of orthodoxy, as he sees it, is that you should be absolutely optimistic, absolutely pessimistic. You should be fully both. And he sees
only in a paradoxical sense that that the two taken by themselves and in conjunction with each other as apparent contradictions point to a deeper truth. Because, in other words, that taken apart, optimism by itself is wrong and incorrect. Pessimism by itself is wrong and incorrect. But you bring the two together in some sort of, it's like a paradox, like the first shall be last, the last shall be first, right? That logically is a load of nonsense. Jesus Christ says it. Logically, the first is not last and the last is not first by definition, right? But if they're brought together in some sort of paradoxical collision, what is love? Love is putting the other person last, right? The first shall be last is the act of self-sacrificial love, right? So when you see it in that sense, the paradox comes alive. So yes, pessimism. So orthodoxy insists that there is original sin. And Chesterton spends quite a lot of time on the absolute primal reality of original sin, that we are broken and we are prone to sin. We are prone to darkness and to wickedness, right? So that's pessimistic, right? It's much more pessimistic than the Rousseauian view of the noble savage, right? But if you take that radical pessimism, original sin, and put it together with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? In other words, redemption, then yes, we are broken. Yes, that pessimistic understanding of it is true, that we are not a naturally good people who are not prone to evil. We are prone to evil. But there's a path we can take which unites us with perfection, unites us with God. And Christ shows us the perfect human being. And can we ever be as perfect as Christ? No. But the more that we try to be as perfect as Christ, the better, more Christ-like we become, the better we become, and the happier we become, and the more fully real we become, because Christ, if Christ is who he says he is, right, and the last part of orthodoxy is to show us that he is who he says he is, then he is the perfect human being. So the more we become like Christ, the more fully human we're becoming. And it's that the more fully human we're becoming, the actual happier we become, right? And it's because we're still prone to the sinfulness, but through grace and through keeping our eyes on heaven, we can come to sanctity. And again, to reiterate, because this again, with Orthodoxy, it's always the crucial thing of my own conversion was Chesterton showed me, and it's what this book shows us, is that I was raised, I'm a modern person. I mean, even though I'm older than you, I'm relatively modern. You know, I was raised that you have to choose between faith or reason, right? You can have faith, and therefore you have the comforts of religion, but you've got to abandon reason to get that comfort. Or you can have reason. In that case, you have to abandon faith and live in this sort of rather uncomfortable world of hopelessness, ultimately, because what is there to hope in? So you have to choose between faith and reason. And what Chesterton showed me, and of course he's pursuing orthodoxy, is that faith and reason are indissolubly married. That faith and reason are actually the faith, the Christian faith, orthodoxy, is in conformity with reason. And reason, if it's not going to become irrational, has to be in conformity with orthodoxy. So this marriage of faith and reason, that's what Chesterton's doing in orthodoxy, and that's what's crucial in our own day and age, because it's still this schizophrenic idea that we have to be one or the other. We can't be both. Chesterton bridges that gap.
And he says that, in fact, if you don't accept orthodoxy and you go about society trying to improve it without accepting the tenets of the Christian faith, and you are, say, a liberal, you actually end up making society worse. You actually end up making it illiberal. And again, paradoxically, as ever, if you took the dogmas that Chesterton takes as the foundations for reason, then you would achieve true freedom and you would achieve true progress within society. Could you tell us a little bit about why he thinks those social consequences will come about through a lack of faith?
Yeah, there's a wonderful paradoxical statement by Edmund Burke, that liberty itself must be limited in order to be possessed. So in other words, the other way of looking at it, Oscar Wilde says in one of his poems, anarchy is freedom's own Judas. All right. So the absence of law, liberalism taken as an end in itself, freedom as an end in itself, ends up in slavery. And you can see it in a practical individual sense, the slavery of sin, that basically if we want to do what we like, we become addicted to our bad habits, right? Whatever that is, sex, drugs, rock and roll, whatever, right? That we become addicts. And if you're an addict, you're not free. An addict is not free. And the addict might say that I want to be free to take my next fix. But he's abandoned his freedom in pursuit of something which has now possessed him. He's become possessed. So he's a slave. So if we want to have freedom, we have to accept and embrace a limitation upon our freedom. We have to follow the path of virtue. And again, the easiest way of saying this is, what is anarchy? If you have no law at all, you don't have a hippie garden of Eden. What you have is the gangs taking over. All right. If there's a vacuum that's left by the absence of law, the most ruthless step into the vacuum. And then you have gang law, and then you have that sort of tyranny, and then some strong man comes in who basically says we're done with this anarchy, and then you have tyranny. Right? You have totalitarianism. So you see this being played out throughout the whole of history. I mean, go back to St. Augustine, the city of God and the city of man. These are always in conflict, and at best there's a tension. At worst, there's a war. And that's why the Catholic Church, or the church on earth, is the church militant, right? The church at war. We are Milus Christi, because soldiers of Christ, because there is no path to peace in this world, because there's always going to be many people who will not embrace the path of sanctity, that are going to demand the right to do what they want. And as long as there's those people there, and they're always going to be there, you're going to have this chaos in the world, in real politics, in politics. But, and this is the but, the more that Christianity is respected and practiced, the more justice there is in society, the less that Christianity is respected and trusted and practiced, the more injustice you have. And again, you look at history, look at the French Revolution, look at the rise of the Nazis, look at the atheism of the Marxists, right? You're looking at tens of millions of people slaughtered. Be my brother or I'll crack your skull.
Until the final chapter, Chesterton is talking about the healthiness of Christian belief on a personal and on a social level. And it's only actually in the final chapter that he really deals seriously with demonstrating the positive truth of the creed. One of the things I'd like to pick up on is how Catholic Chesterton sounds. So he talks about faith as being based in the authority of the church, and the truth is being demonstrated in the authority of the church in the way that as a child you can trust your father because he's shown you so many truths before. How important do you think that is as a justification for the truth of Chesterton's position? And how interesting do you think it is that he's ostensibly not a Catholic at this time and yet is propounding that kind of argument for God's existence?
The paradox of Chesterton's position is he was a Catholic long before he became a Catholic. Most people that read Orthodoxy thought that Chester was a Catholic. Same thing actually with most people when they read C.S. Lewis's The Pilgrim's Regress, which was Lewis's own quasi-autobiographical progress towards Christian belief, believed he was Catholic, and Lewis was horrified. Chesterton, we've been another 14 years before Chesterton's received into the church, but he's not 14 years away from the church when he writes this. The delay is because he did not want to become a Catholic without Francis, without his wife coming with him. As I said, he was very dependent upon her, and this world-changing step, this abysmal step where you have to be crossing the abyss from one world to the other, is not something he wanted to do without because he was worried it would put this abyss between them, right? But in the end, he felt absolutely morally compelled to take the step without her, and it's the only thing in their marriage he did without her. And she was in tears, and tears of joy or tears of sadness, probably both, when she attended his reception to the church. But 2 or 3 years later, she becomes a Catholic herself, and then for the last years of their life, they're united in the creed. So thanks be to God for that. But that was the delay. And this book is essentially a Catholic book. It's certainly Orthodox. So high church Anglicans, at least in the early 20th century, could probably subscribe to everything in it. And although I'm sure they have to gloss one or two things, Protestant evangelicals would agree with most of it. Because he doesn't talk too much about sacramental theology and things like that. But for instance, a passage I like from the final chapter, I think it's the final chapter. It is the final chapter, where he basically says that with the allegation that Christianity, led to the Dark Ages. He says, on the contrary, Christianity was anything that led us out of it. It was the bridge, between one civilization and the next was Christianity, particularly, of course, Benedictine Christianity, the monasteries that kept the light of civilization going when non-Christian barbarians took over. There's that. And then the most important thing I love about it, and this absolutely ties in with the end of The Man Who Was Thursday, is when he says at the end, that the one thing that Christ concealed from us is his mirth. This is not just delightful, but it's almost shocking, right? Because you read the gospel, and there's the shortest sentence in the gospel is Jesus wept, right? There's no Jesus laughed, okay? But we can't really believe, right, that God, who surely must be the source of all joy and all happiness, does not smile and laugh, right? And again, if you look at the Imago Dei, what makes us different from the other creatures? Then what is the image of God in us that distinguishes us from other creatures? the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? So the ability to love, to rationally choose to lay down our lives for someone else, to overcome the natural tendency to selfishness, right? So the good, the true, to reason, to actually be able to abstractly work out, how far the sun is from us, how long it takes light to get to us, to reason. And then the beautiful, right? That to see that something is alive. I don't mean biological life. A sunset is alive, right? So I see the good, the true, the beautiful in the words of Jesus Christ. I am the way of goodness. I am the truth of reason. I am the life of beauty, of creation and creativity. In other words, this is God the creator, man the creator. All right. So we can love the good. We can reason the true. We can create. We can see beauty. We can do beauty. We are creative like God. But we can also laugh, right? No other creature laughs. Humor is something part of the Imago Dei in it, and it's also in this book. If I remember, I'm sure it is, where he says, "Angels can fly because they take themselves lightly, and the devil fell by the force of his own gravity." In other words, pride is taking ourselves too seriously. Right? Holiness is taking ourselves lightly so that we can fly towards the one who makes us. So the fact, that he ends with the ultimate happy ending, not just the man laughing, but God himself laughing.
And that's taken us to the end of the book. How was Orthodoxy received when it came out?
Well, in some ways, it was a watershed moment, because Chesterton was very popular before he went Orthodoxy, and, if you like, came out as a Christian. Once he came out as a Christian, there was a hostility, but that might be, for most people, going too far. But there was now a mistrust. Chesterton was good fun when he was throwing out paradoxes about things that didn't really matter, like writing an essay about cheese, or what I found in my pocket, or running after one's hat. These are all delightful, and there's actually some very good philosophy and thrown in. But these are all delightful. Now he's getting serious, right, and talking about orthodoxy and Christianity. So the secular world never quite trusted him again. But of course, in the Christian world, he became a champion. And it was hugely influential, for instance, on the conversion of Ronald Knox shortly afterwards, on the Maurice Spearing, actually around the time that Chesterton wrote this book. Maurice Spearing came into the church. Tolkien was received into the church in 1900, so before this, but this came out when he was 16 years old, and he was devouring Chesterton. When Lewis discovers Chesterton's The Everlasting Man, is not the first book he reads, book of essays, but the most important book on his conversion. But of course, he knows orthodoxy. So Chesterton becomes a champion of Christian orthodoxy. And when I wrote my book, Literary Converts, very, very briefly, Elliot, the Catholic literary revival really begins with in 1798 with the publication of lyrical ballads by Coleridge and Wordsworth. Romanticism, this rejection of the cynicism and the empiricism of the Enlightenment, the scientism of the Enlightenment, and leapfrogging over all of that and rediscovering the medieval. So neo-medievalism, various manifestations of pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the Oxford movement, the Gothic revival in architecture. And then that's all very important upon Newman's conversion. And then Newman's conversion is is 1845. Then have what I call the Newman period. From 1845, Newman's reception of the church to his death in the 1890s. But the period from 1900 to 1936 is the Chesterton period, right? He is the giant, and everything seems to revolve around him. And when I wrote Literary Converts, looking at other writers who became Catholics, it was astonishing how many of them, to one degree or another, have been influenced by the reading of Chesterton. And of course, Orthodoxy and The Everlasting Man are the two giant books that these people were referring to. So this book is crucial to 20th century history, certainly literary history, and to the Catholic revival and the Christian revival generally. I mean, Lewis never became a Catholic, for instance, and he was a convert largely due to the influence of Chesterton. So Chesterton is a giant, and this book is one of the most important books he wrote. So I'm really pleased that we've had time to discuss it.
No, and Chesterton is himself very conscious of that tradition in Orthodoxy. Even before we get to Everlasting Man, he's full of praise for the medieval period and holds it up against the classical era as a period in which people understood everything. I think he says, even if they're at war about everything else. And if people have read and enjoyed Orthodoxy and it is their first Chesterton, and where would you suggest they go next? I know you spoke at the beginning about how that is an impossible question, but I will pose it nevertheless.
Yeah, well, I say if they want a panoramic overview, I would suggest they read my book, Wisdom and Innocence. But if they like Orthodoxy, in other words, they enjoy Chesterton's jousting with heresy and error and defending the faith, Christian apologetics, in other words, then the other great book would be The Everlasting Man, which was published in 1926, I believe. So long while after this, after Chesterton became a Catholic. But also his biography of Francis of Assisi is wonderful, and his biography of Thomas Aquinas is wonderful. So if it's specifically the Catholic apologetics that interests people because they enjoyed Orthodoxy, then they would be the next obvious ones to take a look at.
Perfect. And Joseph, thank you very much. I think we'll leave it there. But you've been a wonderful guide through Chesterton's life and through the book. And I will just again mention your website, josephpearce.co, as a useful place to go for people.
jpearce.co, Elliot.
jpearce.co. But it's a useful place to find your work on Chesterton and your other work. And there are various other media appearances on there that would be very...
Yeah, if people want to find out what I'm up to, then that's the place to go.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.